Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we got a terrestrial episode this week. So what are you going to talk to us about today, Drew?
Well, I thought about lots of different things. It's starting to feel like fall outside. It's first week of September as we record this. It'll be going out the second week in September. I actually had a question from an old high school friend about mourning doves.
Yeah.
This last week, or not last week, but a couple days ago. And
I thought,
is
that season, right?
Yeah, it's mourning dove season.
Yeah.
And I thought about discussing some mourning dove biology stuff and things about hunting mourning doves today, and maybe we'll do that in the future. But I looked at our website, and we've got a lot of hits on our vole page right now.
Did you say mole page or vole page?
I said vole with a V.
With a V.
Yeah. And since I try to make sure we do some wildlife damage stuff, I wanted to focus on them this week, since people are seeking out information about voles. So, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting thing to seek out information on, I think. To me, I didn't learn about a vole until I was in college, I think, and taken some sort of mammalogy class. So a mole, I'm much more familiar with that. But what is a vole with a V?
Sure. So a vole is a species of rodent, and more specifically here, where we live in Kansas and throughout most of the Great Plains, there's going to be, depending on where you live, 3, 4, 5 species of voles that might be around. People may be more familiar with another group of species in that same family, or it might even be a subfamily, but lemmings are a lot more familiar to a lot of people than voles are. But voles and lemmings are herbivorous rodents. They're not as big as a rat, but they're about as big as a big mouse when they're an adult. So I tend to, since I did small mammal research, I think in grams when I'm thinking about this stuff rather than ounces. And so I had to go look at another source. But if you think about an adult vole, we're talking about 1 to 2 ounces. If we're thinking like a mammalogist, it's going to be 30 grams, 40 grams, somewhere in there if we're thinking about a big pregnant female. But thinking about the differences between voles and moles, if folks are thinking maybe I got a mole problem or maybe I got a vole problem, voles, we tend to not see damage in the form of a soil disturbance. We tend to see damage due to them feeding on plants of some kind that we care about most of the time. When we're thinking about mole damage, then we're going to think about soil disturbances, right? We've talked about moles a lot, but we see the runs out in the yard with the raised soil that's going to be kind of spongy feeling because that's their trail underneath, or we see where they've been cleaning out their tunnels and that's a mound of soil.
And are these voles, do they live underground like moles do, or is it a little bit different than that?
They do. So that's one of the similarities, but it's not, moles are a critter that we would rarely see above ground, right? They're doing almost all they're carrying out almost all of their activities below the soil. Voles, on the other hand, live in a colony, and that colony is going to be below the ground. We're going to see a whole bunch of entrances that go down into, if it was burned off, like out in the middle of the prairie, or if we were looking at a no-till row crop agricultural field that had a vole colony in it, you would see a sort of a raised mound of soil that might be 3 feet in diameter and 6 inches taller than the soil around it. And what you're seeing there is, probably several seasons worth of soil excavation to create that colony that's down below the ground. But it's going to have multiple entrances going to it, and that's where they're going to rest. That's where they might create food caches. but all of their foraging activity when they're out, feeding and that sort of thing is going to be above ground. And they create really well-defined travel paths out away from that colony that mounded soil. And so what you're going to see is these runs above the ground, and they clip a lot of vegetation around that run. And so you'll see like an inch or two wide. If it's 2 inches wide, that's probably cotton rats, which are very similar to prairie voles in terms of a lot of their biology and behavior. But a vole run is probably going to be an inch or an inch and a half wide, and it's going to be almost bare soil, typically below a canopy of vegetation. And a lot of times there's going to be a whole bunch of branches that come off of that too. They can occupy like a home range of a 1/4 acre around their colony. So when they're out foraging, they can travel a fair distance to do that foraging.
Sure. When I look at a vole, it reminds me a lot of a mouse, right?
Yeah.
And so what are some differences? Is it a type of mouse, or what are some differences between a vole and a mouse?
Well, they're not a type of mouse. They're in a different subfamily. But the important things to think about if we're trying to identify small mammals are tail length, how pointy is its nose, how well furred is its tail, how well furred are its ears. Is it strongly dorsoventrally bicolored, which that's a mouthful, right? But is it a drastically different color on its back and sides than it is on its belly? And so when we're thinking about all of those things, when we think about the commensal rodents, so that's house mice, Norway rats, they come from the old world. They come from Africa and Europe, and in North America, they came over on ships. Right? And so the house mouse and the Norway rat are going to be not strongly dorsoventrally bicolored. So their belly might be a little bit lighter than their back, but it's not going to be white compared to brown. They're not going to have well-furred ears. So their ears are going to be very obvious, and they're not going to be super hairy. And they're going to have a long tail that's also not well-furred. And so it kind of appears scaly and that sort of thing. When we think about our native rats and mice, so, just a few of them might be deer mouse if we're thinking about mice, harvest mice, those sorts of critters. And then on the rat side of things, I already mentioned cotton rats, but we can also have wood rats, eastern wood rats in Kansas, southern plain wood rats if you're way out west in Kansas. And those species would be really common throughout most of the Great Plains. They tend to have more well-furred tails. They tend to be more dorsoventrally bicolored for most of the species, not all of them. So if we're thinking about the deer mouse, which is the most abundant mammal in North America, it's brown above and it's really bright white below. And that's going to be the most common native mouse that people are going to oftentimes see in a house, right? And they don't tend to live in super high densities in houses unless it's an abandoned house, or they will come in during the fall, right? They're trying to escape those harsh conditions outside, maybe find a better place to spend the winter. But they're going to have a more well-furred tail, and their ears have hair on them, but they don't look super hairy. So they're not usually naked, but they're going to have those obvious ears. They also tend to have a pointy face, right? That rostrum or the part of their skull that's between the eyes and the tip of the nose is long, narrow, and they get that pointy face. If we're thinking about cotton rats or voles or lemmings, they tend to have a short face. All of these rodents tend to have pretty big eyes, but cotton rats, voles have really well-furred ears. They also tend to have what we would call hispid coloration above, which that's another weird word, right?
That's right, big words.
Yeah, but that tends to mean sort of like a salt and peppery coloration. So it's not white and black salt and pepper, but it tends to be more of a yellow and brown salt and pepper. So we see that kind of like a rabbit's back, right? An eastern cottontail has that same sort of camouflage that comes from that. They also have short tails. The voles do. Cotton rats would have a much shorter tail than a wood rat would. But the voles almost have kind of a torpedo shaped. Their head does not narrow that much relative to the rest of their body, and when they're stretched out, it's just sort of like they've got a blunt face and a blunt tail end, and they're about the same diameter all the way down. Of the different species of voles that we have in the Great Plains and especially Kansas, the most common one would be the prairie vole, and the scientific name tells us what to look for when we're identifying that one. So it's Microtus ochrogaster, and Microtus is just a genus that a lot of the voles are in. But ochrogaster, what do you suppose that means, Joe?
Well, I don't know what that means.
Okay, well, ochro means orange.
Okay.
And gaster means belly.
Okay.
So it's the vole with an orange belly.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So if we've got a critter with a short tail, and when I mean short, we're talking about somewhere between 3 and 6 inch mammal, and its tail is like an inch long, right? It can be strongly bicolored on its tail too. It can have a dark top and a lighter bottom. That lighter bottom tends to be that same orange color that's on its belly. So short tail, 3 to 6 inch long mammal, blunt face, hairy ears, orange belly. That's a prairie vole. Meadow voles look very similar. They can have just a little bit longer tail, but again, their tail's going to look super short compared to their body. They tend to have more of a gray belly than an orange belly, but otherwise they're going to look pretty similar. In Kansas, meadow voles are restricted really to north central Kansas, kind of the northern Smoky Hills area, and they're not very common in Kansas. But throughout the northern Great Plains, they can be pretty abundant. In far eastern Kansas, then we have the woodland vole. And when I talked about the behavior of the prairie vole and the meadow vole, they spend most of their time above ground when they're out foraging and that sort of thing. Woodland voles are kind of weird in that they tend to be in pretty deep forest with deep leaf litter. And so those trails that they make are oftentimes below the leaf litter, and so you might never see the trails. You might have, if you've got voles hanging out in a yard or something like that and they're causing problems, you might find their colony, that raised area with some entrances, but then those trails that we talked about are going to be down below the leaf litter. So they're a little bit different. They tend to be much redder than a prairie vole or a meadow vole, but they can be a little bit confusing because they have that same kind of orangish color on their belly. And then the fourth one that we have in Kansas that, I mean, for all intents and purposes that most people are going to think about, it's a vole, but we call it a southern bog lemming. And that critter, it tends to be in the eastern half of Kansas. Some of the information that you look at associates them with wet areas. Some of it doesn't from a research standpoint. So that's not necessarily a good description. The couple of things that I think are sort of unique about southern bog lemmings: they've got a much shorter tail. They tend to be more of a darker gray color than those other voles. They've got grooved incisors, and so if you catch one and scruff it, get it by the nape of the neck and pull its top lip back, you'll see those grooves in its upper incisors. But the cool thing is they poop green. And so as a mammologist out there checking live traps, you open up a trap, you look down in there to see what you got, and you see that green poop down in there. It's a bog lemming.
When I was a younger kid in high school or something, I had teachers that would always talk about different types of poops and how they were using that to identify things, and I thought they were crazy. But Here I am chatting with you about the green poop of a vole, or a lemming, I guess.
Yeah.
But funny how all that stuff goes full circle. I'm guessing that green poop has something to do with what it's eating.
Well, they're all herbivores. So all voles and lemmings are going to be herbivores. They eat lots of green vegetation. I think that the green feces that those southern bog lemmings have actually probably has something to do with how their digestion is different from that of voles. But that's one area that I don't have enough knowledge about to be able to tell you anything.
You're not a poop expert, is what you're telling us.
Well, I can identify it, but I don't know why it is the way it is, I guess.
That's fine. Thinking about these critters seem like they're fairly abundant. What does their reproduction look like? Do they reproduce once, multiple times? What are they doing?
Sure. Most of these rodents that are smaller, rats and mice, are capable of having multiple litters per year. Whether they do or not tends to have to do a lot with the environmental conditions. Some of the information out there about voles indicates that they can have a litter per month throughout the entire year.
Why aren't we tripping over voles when we're out in the prairie?
Well, there's a whole lot of different things that eat voles, and so that's definitely a reason. I haven't ever experienced that kind of reproduction from voles where we live in Kansas, in northeast Kansas, in the northern Flint Hills when I was doing my small mammal work. But apparently some places they can have that many litters. We tend to see in really good conditions during the growing season, they might have a litter every month or even every 2 months throughout that growing season. A litter is going to be somewhere between 3 and 5 young on average. And so, that female can replace herself maybe a dozen times throughout the growing season where we live. And so when conditions are really good, we can see what we call eruptions of voles. And we see the same thing with cotton rats too. They have the same sort of biology as voles do from that standpoint. But, if we have quite a bit of rain and relatively mild temperatures, then that grows lots of vegetation. And for a herbivore, that means there's lots of food out there. The other thing is that these critters tend to be sort of cover limited. And so if there's lots of tall grass, lots of tall other kinds of vegetation that help protect them from predators, then they're a lot more likely to be able to survive long enough to replace themselves with a litter or multiple litters. And so we see these sort of eruptions of abundance of these critters.
Yeah, and you said good conditions there a couple times, and so that just means lots of growth of plants, or lots of rainfall. What does that mean?
Well, where we live, it tends to be that lots of growth of plants is very strongly tied to how much rain we get.
Sure.
Right? So just kind of as an example, when I started my graduate research, we were in a prolonged drought and really severe drought conditions. And I was trapping every month of the year, several days throughout the entire year. And I went like a year and a half without ever catching a prairie vole. And then when the drought broke and we started getting plenty of rain and the vegetation started responding, then I started catching voles. And I got covered up with voles. I mean, and we also see that with some of the other mammal species too out there, like deer mice and white-footed mice and stuff, but not to the same degree. In a 1 acre or a couple acre trapping plot, I went from catching like 5 small mammals in a day to catching 110, 120.
Oh, wow.
That's how much that abundance can be different when we've got severe drought conditions and not a lot of vegetation for them to eat, maybe not a lot of seed production for some of the other species and that sort of thing, to we've got plenty of rain and there's lots of grass and forbs and those sorts of things to eat and lots of seeds being produced. So they're really an interesting species from that point of view. Further north, we think about really strong cyclic population fluctuations for lemmings, where we'll see relatively predictable amplitude in that cycle. So we might see peaks in abundance, let's say every 3 years, and it doesn't really matter what what the environmental conditions are. We start seeing an upswing. We get a whole bunch of lemmings, and then all of a sudden reproduction kind of tapers off. Juvenile survival starts tapering off, and that trajectory starts to decline and goes down into a trough, and it stays down there for a few years, and then it comes back up to a peak. And I said 3 or 4 years. That's probably wrong. I don't know what the periodicity is for lemming cycles, but you get the point. It's a regular oscillation of abundance, and voles are different. It tends to be more associated with those environmental conditions than it does other things.
You know, you covered the biology a lot. We learned a lot about voles in general. When we first started, you mentioned damage. It's hard for me to imagine a little vole out in a prairie causing a bunch of damage, but obviously they can be an issue. So what does damage from a vole look like?
Sure. When voles are out in a prairie, they don't really cause any damage. They eat grass, they eat forbs that they clip, and they're just out there eating plants, doing what voles do, and providing food for all kinds of predators. But when they get into turf grass situations like golf courses, parks, areas where people want to have nice grass, when they are in close association with vegetable gardens or nice landscaping type gardens, landscaping plants and that sort of thing, when they're in orchards, when they're in vineyards, when they're in those sorts of places, then they do cause damage. And that damage is directly related to them eating plants. So during the growing season, what we tend to see is they're eating either vegetable-producing broadleaf plants that we might grow in a garden. They might be clipping off flowers that folks want to have out in their yard. And then during the non-growing season, so moving into winter, if green vegetation starts to become limiting for them, then they will eat bark from woody plants. And so that's when we see them become problems in orchards and vineyards and those sorts of things. And basically what they will do is down close to the soil, they'll girdle, meaning eat a ring of bark around the lower portion of that growing tree or grapevine and kill that plant. And sometimes they'll chew all the way through a grapevine or a smaller woody plant that might be out there. One or two voles isn't going to cause enough damage that it really matters most of the time, right? You probably wouldn't even notice it because these things are 1 or 2 ounces and most of the time 3 or 4 inches long, and they're not going to eat enough that it really matters to you, right? But when we start to be in these periods when we get an eruption of prairie voles and they, maybe you have 10, 15 living in a colony, and they're either in your yard, making those trails through the grass and clipping grass around those trails, or they're accessing your vegetable garden or your landscaping plants, then they do become a problem. So it tends to be how many do we have and what's the sort of situation that they're in.
Yeah, and I know you've talked about the HER acronym a lot, but thinking about having 10 or 15 voles, how would we go about controlling that?
Sure.
What would we do for that many individuals? Seems like we'd kind of have to have a management plan.
Yeah, you would. So that HER acronym, so if we think about habitat modification, what the H stands for, it tends to be that voles select for heavy cover. Right? We've talked about that a fair bit. So if you've got grass that's 6 inches tall, then that's providing good cover, or taller, that's providing good cover for the prairie voles. If we were to go out and find them in a prairie, or meadow voles or any of these species, if you were to find them in a prairie, you wouldn't go to annually burned and heavily grazed stuff. That's not going to have enough cover for them. You'd go to the patches that haven't been burned for a year or two, even whether they're grazed or not. But they're they depend on heavy cover. So the taller the grass is in your yard, or the taller the grass is adjacent to your yard too. So I see prairie vole trails that are coming out of a hay meadow next to somebody's nice lawn, right? So the taller the cover that's close by, the more likely there are to be voles. That cover can also be mulch. It can be snow. It could be the hay from our mowing operation. So, thinking about other situations beyond a yard, if we are mowing an orchard or mowing a vineyard and we're blowing all of our exhaust or the cut hay from our mowing up against those valuable trees, we're mulching those trees or vines, and we're creating cover for those voles to access them. So don't blow the hay up against important plants. Mow your grass short or as short as you can feasibly. If you're having prairie vole issues or vole issues in general, you can't really do anything about snow. But one of the things that we oftentimes see is, like, let's say in a golf course, we've got a rough area, right? And that's where the prairie voles probably want to be most of the time. But they're in that rough area, and then we get 6 inches of snow, and it's really cold like the winter we had last year, and that snow stays around for a couple of weeks. Well, those voles are going to have already some small trails that go out into the nice grass that's next to the rough. But when they've got that snow cover on, they're going to go out there, and almost all the feeding activity that they do is right next to those little trails that are almost invisible most of the time because they got a canopy of grass over the top of them. But they clip all the grass around those trails. And so when the snow melts, now all of a sudden you've got this crazy looking area that just looks like all of a sudden the voles showed up and maybe there was 500 of them and they ate all the grass in that spot. And really, it's not 500 of them. It's probably 1 to 10. But when all their feeding activity gets restricted into an area with short grass like that, then we see those kind of crazy problems.
Yeah. So that the habitat modification exclusion, I would guess, getting rid of some of those habitats that we don't want them around. Could you fence out a vole?
You can, yeah. It's a lot harder than it is for some other species. And typically, if we're thinking about fencing out a vole, we're not thinking about fencing them out of a yard, right? If we've got young trees or trees in an orchard that we're concerned about voles girdling down towards the base, then we can create tree guards, basically, that we would make out of like 1/4-inch hardware cloth. Those would need to be very tight to the ground. You wouldn't want any gap underneath of them because the voles would be able to get underneath any gap in there and get to the tree. But making a tree guard out of 1/4-inch hardware cloth, make it relatively tall because they would be able to climb over that stuff. So, it's going to need to be a foot probably or 18 inches tall. So that would be a way to exclude them. Another kind of one of those things that borders between habitat modification and exclusion is if you've got valuable plants, whether it's grapevines in a vineyard, trees, that sort of thing. If you have a relatively bare area for 3 to 4 feet around it, then that oftentimes will create a large enough barrier that would be sort of a predator. It would be a scary environment for them to be in, right? You've created a landscape of fear is what ecologists would call it, but they're scared to go out in that because they might get picked off by a predator.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And speaking of predators, I mean, I'm guessing the last thing is that, we could be a predator of sorts and get rid of them. And so would you trap a vole? Would you, poison them somehow? How would you get rid of them if you needed to, do that removal stage of the HER acronym?
Sure. So for removal, the most practical thing for most people to do would be trapping them, but there's not a lot of folks that want to put that effort in sometimes. So before I forget about this, I want to make sure I say it because I might forget. The other thing with habitat modification would be removing food sources. And so sometimes I get calls from people who are seeing prairie voles or meadow voles feeding underneath bird feeders and that sort of thing. So if you've got those sorts of food sources in a yard and there are voles nearby, then you might promote them being in a place where you don't want them to be, and also potentially supplemental feed them and increase their reproductive output by having those bird feeders out there. So remove those food sources if you can. But going back to lethal control, regular old snap trap style mouse traps can work very, very well for trapping voles. But one of the challenges is we're trapping something outside, right? We're not setting a trap behind a couch or something where we don't have to worry about anything besides a mouse getting into it. And so the way to make those effective and also safe and prevent other critters from getting into them would be to create some sort of roof to put over that trap. You can do that with a shingle. You could fold a shingle in half, make sort of an A-frame out of it, and then put a snap trap in either end of it. I would put a couple of them in there and have the trigger facing out. Bait those with peanut butter. I like to mix a little bit of oatmeal into that peanut butter. That makes it just that much more attractive for those rodents. But yeah, you can trap them that way. You could also make the same sort of cover if you think this might be something that you have to do over and over again out of a piece of gutter. Just maybe a foot or two section of gutter. You could also cut a piece of PVC pipe in half. Just the thing that you have to remember is that striker bar, or the part that's going to whack the vole on the neck to kill it, that has to be able to clear the roof of whatever you're putting in there. But if you are going to set those snap traps outside, you really should cover them with something.
And then check them. I mean, daily
Right.
is what you should do. Is it feasible to go trap 10 or 15 voles? I mean, is that something that can be done in a quick enough manner to stop or reduce the damage that's being done?
It is, but it's not something you're going to do overnight. Really, with any trapping operation, we're not thinking about solving a problem today or tomorrow. It might take a week or two to get them trapped out, and one trap's probably not going to be enough, right? So if you've got damage that's occurring around a flower bed or a vegetable garden or out in a yard, and this is more of a homeowner type situation, right? Then you could definitely trap them out that way. You can also get smaller live traps that are very, very effective for these guys, but it doesn't make sense to trap voles and then go turn them loose somewhere. They tend to be hyper abundant when they're causing problems. So we're not causing any issues for their population viability, and really, like we've said in other episodes, you're probably dooming that critter to a much more inhumane death than you would be if you would just go ahead and euthanize it. Other methods of control that are available to homeowners and also on a more commercial standpoint would be to use toxicants. Again, just like with trapping, if we're applying a toxicant outside, then we have to make sure that only the target species can get to it. That's really, really important. And so what we're going to think about there for these rodents is bait stations. And the important thing to know is that most of the toxicants that are available for rodent control that are general use, meaning anybody can buy them. You don't have to be a pesticide applicator to get them. You can go to the hardware store or the farm store or whatever and buy it. They are labeled for use within and near buildings. Okay, and what it typically says on the label is within 100 feet of a building. So if you have an issue in your yard that is within 100 feet of a building, then you could use those general use pesticides out in your yard to control voles or wood rats. Like I said, it's important to use a bait station. You can make a cheap and easy bait station to use with these sort of pesticides out of PVC pipe. Like 1.5 PVC. You would just make a T. So we would have a leg that's maybe 10 inches and then a PVC T, and then another 10-inch leg, and that piece would sit on the ground. And then standing up off of the other side of the tee would be what we would think of as like a standpipe, right? That's going to be straight up in the air. That's going to have a cap on it. If you're using paraffin bait blocks that have a hole in the middle of them, you can drill a hole in that cap and run a piece of all thread through it. At the bottom, you would put a big washer and a nut below it, and then we would just stack on top of that all thread that's the same size as the hole in the middle of the bait block. We would stack those on the all thread, and then that cap would be on there. Only critters that are small enough to get in the ends of that PVC pipe can access that paraffin bait block. They eat off of the block, and then they go about their merry way, and eventually it's not merry anymore. But the nice thing about that sort of design is that it allows those blocks to drop down after they're eaten. And so if we've got a colonial species where there might be a bunch of them, then that makes that control effort a little bit more efficient. You would have to put some stakes in the ground that holds that tee upright and that sort of thing. You can buy something very similar that's already made that would be a molded plastic design as well. The important consideration there is that in near a lot of urban areas, we see a lot of secondary toxicity in wild predators that are eating these rodents that are eating poison in town, and some of these predators are eating these critters on the outskirts of town. Some of them are eating them right in the middle of town, right? But thinking about the type of product that you use in these poisoning efforts can, if you're concerned about that, I think that's being a good steward, right? And so if we're using a first-generation anticoagulant, there we're talking about a product based on chlorofascinone or diafascinone, or if we're using a warfarin-based product, warfarin is something that a lot of humans take. It's a blood thinner. It's also something that's a pesticide. So those products are much less likely to cause secondary toxicity issues than the second-generation anticoagulants, so products like broadifacum and those sorts of things. And I probably just really butchered that one because that's not something that I say a lot. But the first-gen anticoagulants tend to be safer. There are also acute toxicants like zinc phosphide. That's going to be a restricted use product, though. So that's how we would go about using toxicants to control these critters around a home or that sort of thing. Typically, if we're in a golf course or a park or something like that, we're going to need to make sure that we've got a certified pesticide applicator that's applying those products on a broader scale and further away from buildings and potentially in close proximity to lots of people and that sort of thing. So having that training about how to do that safely is going to be really important. If we're at a golf course, maybe they've got an employee that's an applicator to do this sort of thing, or maybe they're going to hire a company that does these sorts of things for hire. So that's how we would go about chemical control. The other thing that's kind of interesting that we don't hear a lot about in the U.S., there are some older publications from the USDA about this, and I've been seeing some papers come out of places like Japan that are looking at biological control of these critters. And so when we're thinking about biological control, we tend to be either introducing or promoting a natural predator, right? And so the natural predator that we can often promote in areas where we have vole damage is raptors. And so raptor perches are how this is typically done. And so you would basically have a post that might have a tee on top of it that creates a nice perch that allows hawks and especially owls to perch on, because owls are really efficient predators of these voles. A lot of times if you go digging through owl pellets, that's going to be one of the main things that they're eating, right, is voles. Of course, coyotes, they select voles when they're available. There's lots of different predators, but we oftentimes aren't trying to promote coyotes around our gardens and that sort of thing, but putting out perches so that we've got more raptors out there.
Yeah, that's a great, when we think about biological control, especially in the aquatic setting, a lot of times we're adding in different species, but I like just promoting where those animals that are already around, where they're hanging out. I like that technique there. So, well, Drew, that was a great episode. I think I learned a lot about voles. One of the first projects I did as a researcher was with voles, and I still didn't know 90% of this stuff. So I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge. Great episode, and we look forward to having you back next time for an aquatic episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.